He assumed she was just another defendant, nervous out of her element, until she rose, produced her badge, and turned his world upside down. In a county courtroom where oak-paneled walls and hushed voices spoke of long-held tradition, a dignified black woman in simple civilian dress took her seat among the benches. No crisp uniform, no polished badge glinting at her lapel, only a quiet assurance radiated from her posture. Still, spectators and officers offered sidelong glances and exchanged low murmurs. Who is she, they wondered? Why is she here? Their unspoken judgment rested on old assumptions that someone who didn't look the part belonged nowhere near the seat of authority. But she remained composed, hands folded in her lap, gaze steady on the judge's bench. As the bailiff called the next case, she did not flinch. Every footstep on the linoleum, every soft click of pen on paper, reminded her of the strength she carried inside, built over decades of service, sacrifice, and hard-won respect. In that moment, the courtroom felt smaller, its gravity shifting. The weight of tradition met the force of her presence, a woman who knew both the law and her own worth. While some whispered, "She doesn't belong here," she quietly reminded them with her very being that true authority needs no uniform. Here, in a place where power often wore a single face, she offered a lesson in dignity, that respect is earned not by garments, but by unwavering integrity. When at last she stood to speak, drawing out a sleek leather badge stamped with her rank, the hush descended fully. The spectators leaned forward. Officers straightened in surprise, and the judge paused, realizing that this day's proceedings would be unlike any other. In one gentle motion, she had reclaimed the narrative, and a room built on rigid procedure opened itself to real justice. A white patrol officer, eyes narrowed by unspoken prejudice, strode down the aisle without so much as a courtesy nod. He never paused to ask for identification or clarification, only to assert that this woman, seated so serenely among a sea of curious faces, didn't belong. His shoulders squared, voice low and hard, he barked, "You need to come with me," then reached out and grabbed her elbow as though he owned it. The courtroom held its breath. Clerks paused mid-keystroke. Deputies shifted their weight, but did not move to intervene. In that charged silence, the officer's firm grip betrayed nothing of official protocol. It reeked instead of unchecked assumption. He yanked her roughly to her feet, expecting compliance, ready to march her to the exit as though she were a misbehaving child. But she did not flinch. Her back remained erect, her chin lifted, eyes fixed on human decency rather than the badge he wore. In her silence lay a challenge no gesture of aggression could dim her quiet authority. The badge she carried was still hidden beneath her coat, a symbol of her rank that transcended his uniform. Whispers rippled through the rows of observers. "Is he allowed to do that?" one woman murmured to her neighbor. "Why isn't anyone stopping him?" Another asked, voice taut with unease. Yet the courtroom's stalwart tradition of respect, the badge froze them, the legacy of deference swallowing any impulse to defend. With that single unwarranted act of physical force, the patrol officer exposed more than his victim's dignity. He revealed the fault lines in a system that too often trusts assumption over truth. He believed his authority absolute, unaware that real power is never borrowed. It is earned through integrity. The moment stretched. She did not pull away, nor did she plead. Instead, she chose to stand her ground, embodying the very principles he claimed to uphold. In the stillness that followed, every heart in the room acknowledged what they already sensed. This confrontation was not about a misunderstanding. It was about bias confronting its own reckoning, and she would not be moved. He believed he was enforcing order, convinced that his every move followed protocol. But in reality, he had weaponized procedure against a woman whose only crime was occupying space he had decided didn't belong to her. As he tightened his grip, the room's hierarchy tilted on its axis. The judge's bench, once a symbol of impartial justice, now seemed complicit as deputies stood by. Clerks bound by unspoken rules averted their eyes rather than call out misconduct. His confidence swelled as though he stood on solid ground, yet beneath him the courtroom's foundation cracked. Whispers grew louder, exchanging questions that demanded answers no one dared provide. Who is she? Why isn't anyone stopping him? The murmurs threaded through the wood-paneled walls, unraveling the comfort of tradition. Spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, uncertain whether to trust their own sense of right or the badge whose authority had just betrayed it. He never paused to consider that suspicion, when divorce from evidence becomes prejudice. He missed the way her calm steadied the air, how her steady gaze cut through assumption and revealed the fragility of his power. In that silence, every lesson he had learned about respect and duty echoed back as contradiction. He was meant to uphold justice, not enforce his own biases. Unaware, he planted the seeds of his undoing. For every offensive gesture, for every law he bent to fit his prejudice, he chipped away at the credibility he so fiercely guarded. In the hush that followed his aggressive order, the courtroom collectively realized that true authority only belongs to those who respect it, not to those who demand it. And she, still standing firm, had not yet spoken a word. Her silence was not submission, but a promise that the truth would come into view. In the next heartbeat of that courtroom's history, she would show them exactly whose authority mattered and why every assumption they held must now be questioned. In the sudden stillness that followed the scuffle, she reached into the inside pocket of her plain jacket and withdrew a polished, star-shaped badge. With deliberate precision, she turned it toward every face in the courtroom, newly appointed sheriff of the county bearer of its highest law enforcement authority. The metal gleamed under the overhead lights, a quiet affirmation that upended every assumption made in those tense moments. A collective gasp rolled through the room. The judge paused mid-gavel, pen hovering over paperwork. Clerks froze keys above typewriter, poised but unused. Spectators craned their necks, mouths agape, at the revelation that the woman they had dismissed as a mere observer actually held the reins of power in this very jurisdiction. Even the bailiffs trained to enforce order, without question, exchanged astonished looks as they realized whom they served. The officer who had seized her arm lurched backward as if struck. His face drained of color, shock flickering into shame. The swagger he wore moments before collapsed, replaced by a disbelieving slump of shoulders. In an instant, he went from enforcer to interloper, an agent of prejudice, who had overstepped both protocol and respect for rank. His badge no longer protected him. It now exposed his error in judgment. Murmurs rose in pitch and volume, unraveling the courtroom's rigid decorum. "She's the sheriff," someone whispered. "How did he not know?" asked another. Lawyers closed their folders and leaned forward, eyes wide, realizing that the woman's authority legally superseded every uniformed officer in the room, including the man who had attempted her removal. Their silence spoke volumes. This was no simple misunderstanding, but a fundamental breach of respect for justice. The judge set aside the gavel and cleared his throat, struggling to reclaim control over proceedings that had careened into chaos. "Deputy, step forward," he commanded. The word deputy felt both ironic and sobering, marking a reversal of roles in which a deputy must answer to her. She stood tall and composed, badge in hand, embodying the dignity and authority his actions had tried to erase. In that charged moment, the courtroom's power structure lay bare: respect, earned by merit, not assumed by uniform or tradition. The woman's calm demonstration of rank reminded every onlooker that true authority depends on the integrity to wield it justly. And the man who had sought to bully found himself undone by the very hierarchy he had failed to recognize. Shock rippled through the courtroom like a silent wave, sweeping away every pretense of order. The officer's aggressive posture, once so confident, wilted under the weight of collective astonishment. His face burned. Every eye in the room now tracked his every move. What had been a show of authority moments before revealed itself as nothing more than unchecked prejudice. The judge lowered his gavel, speechless for the first time in memory. His usually steady voice cracked as he attempted to restore decorum. "Deputy, please explain yourself." The officer's shoulders sagged. He swallowed hard, eyes darting from the badge in her hand to the judge's expectant gaze. No words readily came. There were none that could excuse his rush to judgment. Across the aisle, attorneys who had been poised to argue procedural minutiae now exchanged grim looks. Their legal briefs and case files lay forgotten on tables irrelevant compared to the raw lesson unfolding before them. Even the court reporter paused mid-keystroke, the steady tap of keys replaced by a hush that filled the chamber. Silence descended heavier than any word. The deputies who had flanked the bailiffs, their hands hovering near holsters, now shifted uncomfortably. Their silence in the officer's initial aggression rendered them inadvertent accomplices to prejudice. They had stood by in blind deference to rank, never questioning a single order. Now their stillness spoke volumes, a stark reminder that justice requires more than obedience. It demands conscience. With a steady breath, she held the badge aloft. The polished star caught the light, its engraved words, Sheriff County of clear for all to see. In that moment, she was no longer a silenced observer, but the embodiment of lawful authority. Every gesture she made exuded the calm confidence of someone who understood that true power lies in fairness, not force. The officer finally found his voice raspy and hesitant. I, I apologize, Sheriff. He stammered, a head bowed. It was a small offering, swallowed by the enormity of his error. The apology landed in the charged air, inadequate, yet necessary, a first step in acknowledging wrongdoing. She nodded once, accepting the apology, but making no further haste to forgive. Justice demanded more than words. As the courtroom staff regrouped, whispered conversations spread like wildfire. This incident would not be swept aside. It would become the catalyst for scrutiny, reform, and the hard work of rebuilding trust between those who wear the badge and those they serve. In that hush, the community found its voice, and the promise of accountability hung in the air, waiting to be claimed. Her composed presence demanded not only an apology, but systemic change. In the wake of that stunned silence, the court clerk rose to notify internal affairs. The announcement cracked across the chamber. An immediate investigation into the officer's conduct would begin. Murmurs swelled as everyone realized this was more than a single abuse of power. It was a symptom of deeper institutional rot. Outside the judge's bench, the bailiff stepped forward to secure the sheriff's badge and escort the shaken officer away for questioning. Deputies followed protocol, but their expressions betrayed a newfound understanding. Blind obedience without critical thought had nearly sacrificed justice itself. They had witnessed how prejudice could masquerade as authority, and now they would be compelled to confront it. Attorneys gathered their notes, but their arguments had taken on fresh urgency. One by one, they approached the bench to request that the court review its procedures for screening witnesses and verifying identities. Judges, once content to rely on appearances, acknowledged that procedural safeguards must be strengthened to prevent similar incidents. The sheriff's intervention had revealed that no badge should ever be hidden behind unchecked bias. In the hallways, court staff convened impromptu meetings. The court administrator announced mandatory bias awareness training for every employee, clerks, marshals, security staff, anyone who stepped into the courtroom. It was a small step, but a necessary one, to ensure that respect for all attendees became institutional practice rather than optional courtesy. News of the confrontation spread quickly through local government. The County Board of Commissioners scheduled an emergency workshop to review law enforcement oversight. Community leaders, civil rights advocates, and faith organizations clamored for seats at the table. They demanded a civilian review board, transparent disciplinary processes, and regular audits of policing practices. The sheriff's dignified stand had sparked a movement. Later that day, the new sheriff held a press conference outside the courthouse steps. She did not raise her voice. She did not vilify individuals. Instead, she spoke of unity, respect, and the principle that no one, regardless of race or rank, should ever be assumed guilty. Her words carried the weight of experience and the promise of real change. In that moment, the courtroom became more than a venue for legal proceedings. It became a catalyst for justice, renewed, a place where dignity and fairness would no longer be optional. The recalibration had begun, and its echoes would shape every corner of the county's justice system. By midday, video of the courtroom confrontation had circled every social media feed. Citizens of all backgrounds watched in disbelief as a seasoned officer's unchecked bias was laid bare. Calls for accountability echoed online, over dinner tables, and in church halls. Rather than retreat into outrage alone, the new sheriff seized the moment to offer tangible solutions. Standing before a throng of microphones on the courthouse steps, she spoke with quiet authority. Every sworn officer in the county would undergo mandatory bias awareness training within 60 days. Internal affairs procedures would be made transparent, with quarterly public reports on complaints and outcomes. And a civilian oversight board composed of neighborhood representatives, clergy, legal advocates, and mental health professionals would be formed to review uses of force and ensure impartial discipline. Her proposals were precise and actionable. She refused to frame them as concessions, but as necessary safeguards to protect both residents and officers. When asked about timing, she set firm deadlines: training modules to be finalized by month's end, the first disciplinary report to publish within 90 days, and the oversight board seated by year's end. These benchmarks transformed what could have been an ephemeral moment of protest into a structured roadmap for reform. Local lawmakers quickly picked up her agenda. Several council members announced intentions to introduce ordinances codifying bias training as part of certification standards. A state representative pledged to sponsor legislation mandating similar measures statewide. Civil rights organizations offered to help vet training curricula and identify qualified board members, while community groups volunteered venues for public forums. Even taxpayer associations welcomed the transparency measures, recognizing that trust in law enforcement was critical to public safety and neighborhood vitality. Throughout it all, the sheriff remained focused on procedure over pageantry. She declined invitations to sensational interviews, instead choosing smaller gatherings in precinct roll calls, town hall meetings, and coffee shop roundtables. There she heard firsthand the concerns of patrol officers wary of being painted with the same brush, single mothers who feared profiling and veterans who understood the weight of a uniform. In each setting, she reiterated that reform was not a retreat from authority, but an enhancement of integrity. By evening, as smartphone screens dimmed across the county, there was a palpable sense that this incident was more than a scandal. It was a turning point. The sheriff's blend of principled leadership and procedural rigor had set a new standard. Her example showed that real change required more than outrage. It demanded clear policies, collaborative oversight, and the unwavering willingness to hold even one's own accountable. The blueprint she drafted that day promised to guide the county toward a justice system defined not by who wielded power, but by how wisely and fairly it was exercised. Within 24 hours, the officer who had manhandled the sheriff was placed on immediate suspension, pending a full internal affairs investigation. His equipment was locked away, and he was barred from all official duties. As news of his misconduct spread, legal scholars cited the incident as a turning point in the battle against racially motivated policing errors. Civil rights groups hailed the sheriff's unwavering composure as more than personal vindication. It was a demonstration that power could be reclaimed by those long marginalized by the very institutions meant to protect them. In community centers and church basements across the county, citizens recounted how moments of aggressive authority too often went unchecked, and how one woman's dignified response had forced a reckoning on everyone's part. Her calm insistence that justice be both blind and accountable reminded people that authority unchecked by empathy or oversight can easily slip into oppression. When systemic barriers are confronted head-on, progress follows not as a concession from the top, but as a demand from the collective. Local universities invited the sheriff to speak about ethical leadership before packed auditoriums, and her words were replayed on public radio. Respect isn't a privilege granted by uniform. It's a standard enforced by integrity. Her phrase became a rallying cry at youth workshops on civic engagement. Even neighboring counties, having followed the story on regional news, began sending delegations to observe the new policies in action, eager to replicate the sheriff's blueprint for reform. Meanwhile, the officer's suspension evolved into formal charges for abuse of authority, and civil suits were filed on behalf of the county taxpayer and community members whose faith in law enforcement had been shaken. Yet perhaps the most profound impact lay not in court rulings or disciplinary reports, but in the shift of everyday consciousness. Patrol officers wearing new bias training patches on their sleeves acknowledged colleagues and residents with greater mindfulness, a visible sign that the conversation about respect had moved from theory into practice. 3 months on, a newly formed civilian oversight board convened its first hearing, inviting public testimony on use of force policies. The sheriff sat in the front row, her posture as composed as it had been under the courtroom lights, a living reminder that reclaiming authority with dignity is more potent than any reprimand or headline. Her story illustrated that when misuse of power is met not with silence, but with measured challenge and principled action, it can spark enduring change, replacing fear with faith and mistrust with mutual accountability. Disclaimer. This story is entirely fictional. All characters and events are creations of the author and are not intended to reference or criticize any real person. It is designed to raise awareness of responsibility, justice, and the importance of treating one another with respect and dignity. We firmly oppose all forms of violence, prejudice, and injustice. Please consider this before viewing.